How should a major power react when an enemy helicopter evades all its radar systems and strikes one of its destroyers head-on? Before we continue, subscribe if you believe the United States must respond firmly to the attack on the USS Carney. What you're about to see was not a minor incident, but a precise operation that exposed critical weaknesses in a system once considered impenetrable. For some, it was a calculated move. For others, a provocation capable of triggering a regional crisis. What's certain is that night in the Caribbean, someone pushed the tension to the limit. Who acted correctly? Stay until the end and decide for yourself. As the day came to an end, and the Caribbean sky turned orange, no one imagined that a single projectile was about to shift the military balance of an entire region in a matter of seconds. A Venezuelan helicopter, flying so low it nearly skimmed the sea surface, managed to slip past radar detection. It approached the USS Carney like a faint silhouette. The US crew had no time to react before a missile launched, struck the destroyer's bow, and caused a fire that nearly split the ship in two. What happened next shocked even the most seasoned commanders, because the attack wasn't a mistake or an accidental encounter. It was a deliberate message. And what came afterward would be even more revealing. The USS Carney sailed north at a steady pace, across a calm, red-tinted sea, unaware it was minutes away from becoming the center of a political and military storm across the Western Hemisphere. 34 nautical miles north of Margarita Island, an area the US considered relatively stable, the environment shifted abruptly. A faint signal appeared on the ship's peripheral radar, interpreted at first as atmospheric distortion. But what seemed like background noise was actually a Venezuelan helicopter flying extremely low, using a concealment technique known as low masking to evade detection. The aircraft was part of a mission directly overseen by Venezuelan Colonel Rafael Uzcategui, leader of a tactical air attack group. It had taken off from San Aurelio Bay following a carefully planned route through the deep blue corridor, a zone where thermal signatures disperse easily, allowing aircraft to advance without leaving clear infrared traces. Meanwhile, the USS Carney, under US Captain Michael Ratz, continued routine patrols without activating maximum alert levels. There were no signs of hostile activity or indications that Venezuela might carry out a direct strike. But the Caribbean would once again prove it can hide more tension than any military assessment can foresee. Inside the Venezuelan helicopter, silence was absolute. Any radio transmission could be intercepted by US surveillance systems. Beyond flying low, the aircraft carried small experimental thermal scatter devices, initially designed to confuse air-to-air missiles. These emit microscopic particles that distort the engine's infrared signature, making the target nearly impossible to classify on military radar. For the Carney's operators, the flickering echoes on screen were too inconsistent to resemble a real aircraft. The crew debated whether the signal was a bird, a sailboat mast, or metallic interference. They didn't know they had already been designated as the primary target. When the helicopter entered the area known as Echo Delta 7, its crew activated the short-range missile guidance system. Colonel Uzcategui issued a firm, brief order authorizing the launch. The aircraft descended even lower, seeking the perfect angle for a near point-blank attack. The missile left the helicopter with a small, hard-to-see trail. Seconds later, it hit the USS Carney's bow, unleashing a violent explosion. A sphere of fire rose and scattered metal fragments across the deck, causing the sensors to interpret multiple simultaneous impacts. The shockwave rattled the destroyer's internal structure. Communications failed. Several sailors were thrown against the bulkheads, and alarms activated late, worsening the chaos. Captain Ratz rushed toward the control center, struggling to maintain balance as the ship temporarily lost maneuvering capability. Beneath the forward deck, a new danger emerged. The fire ignited secondary stores, and a second explosion threatened to turn the attack into an irreversible catastrophe. The night had only begun, and would soon test not only US military technology, but the endurance of its crew. Colonel Uzcategui's plan was clear from the start. Exploit every thermal anomaly, every shadow, every favorable current to approach undetected. The deep blue corridor had both tactical and political value. It demonstrated that Venezuela could still carry out precision operations against a force widely seen as untouchable. Venezuelan pilots flew mere meters above the sea, a dangerously demanding maneuver requiring constant adjustments. Low masking let them hide behind wave crests, minimizing radar detection. Aboard the USS Carney, the crew continued their routine, unaware of the threat moving just beyond radar reach. The thermal scatter units on the Venezuelan helicopter warped its heat signature, making it appear too small for a helicopter and too fast for a drone. Inside the Venezuelan cabin, Uzcategui ordered complete silence as they crossed a narrow maritime corridor known for strong lateral gusts, the last stretch before the attack. Any slight altitude change could trigger US sensors. On the Carney, a young operator noticed a faint blip on his screen, but dismissed it as atmospheric noise. Neither he nor the captain realized it was the approaching enemy. Once within 900 meters, the helicopter dropped even lower, almost touching the water. The target was confirmed, and Uzcategui authorized the final sequence. The missile struck the bow, sending a violent tremor through the ship. Alarms went off, and sailors were thrown to the deck by the blast. A dense, penetrating smell of burned fuel spread through the narrow corridors of the USS Carney. The flames, already intensified by the first impact, had reached a sensitive storage area where even a minor rise in temperature could generate catastrophic consequences. Communications flickered, sometimes working, sometimes falling completely silent, leaving several sections unable to coordinate properly. Emergency response teams rushed to contain the situation, moving through smoke-filled passageways as sparks and fragments of glowing metal rained across the deck, carried by strong gusts rising from the open sea. Inside the radar room, the atmosphere was tense and filled with disbelief. US technicians examined every data fragment they could extract, trying to understand how an aircraft had managed to approach with such precision without triggering alarms. Heat signatures appeared distorted, trajectories broke mid-screen, and patterns of interference created gaps that made interpretation nearly impossible. Everything pointed to the use of Venezuelan thermal scatter systems, devices specifically designed to disrupt infrared tracking and confuse radar detection. After repeated attempts, one operator finally managed to reconstruct the missile's complete approach path. When he announced that the attack had been intentional and precisely executed, a heavy silence filled the room. The captain immediately assumed direct command, activated the highest emergency protocol, and redirected all available resources toward containing the rapidly expanding fire. Shortly afterward, a specialist reported that the explosion had caused several critical valves to shift out of alignment, resulting in leaks of vapor and combustible fluid that further fed the flames. Sealing off multiple compartments was the only viable way to prevent the situation from escalating, but doing so meant trapping crew members inside isolated sections, a difficult but necessary decision to avoid a larger disaster. Moments later, internal sensors detected a sudden and dangerous spike in pressure within a secondary module. The readings were clear. If the fire reached that compromised chamber, a second explosion was imminent. The captain warned everyone on board and instructed the teams to brace for impact while attempting to prevent the flames from spreading further. Meanwhile, some functionality returned to the external surveillance systems, revealing an irregular heat trace heading east. It was the Venezuelan helicopter responsible for the attack, flying at extremely low altitude to evade countermeasures. The Carney attempted to prepare its defensive systems for retaliation, but the internal emergency took priority. If the fire reached the pressurized storage area, the consequences would be far more destructive than any external threat. Then the feared event occurred. A second explosion burst from inside the ship. Though smaller than the initial strike, it was powerful enough to shake the destroyer from bow to stern, causing the vessel to tilt abruptly and forcing the captain to order immediate stabilization procedures. Alarms echoed across the compartments as crew members struggled to keep their footing. At the same time, in San Aurelio Bay, Colonel Uzcategui began reorganizing Venezuelan forces, fully aware that retaliation was now a real possibility. Colombia increased maritime monitoring along its coastline, while Brazil deployed a frigate north of Amapá, signaling regional concern over potential escalation. Back on the USS Carney, the crew continued to fight exhaustion, lingering smoke, and the constant fear of yet another internal blast. As dawn broke, the captain walked through scorched hallways, taking in the extent of the damage and the emotional toll on his sailors. Across the sea, in Venezuelan territory, the helicopter pilot who had carried out the strike admitted quietly that he feared for the safety of his family should the United States choose to retaliate. An admission that made Colonel Uzcategui reflect deeply on the true weight and consequences of his decisions. As the Caribbean regained its deceptive calm, one question lingered. Who truly provoked this dangerous shift? The USS Carney remained operational, but wounded. Venezuela defended its decision as the region watched how a single missile nearly ignited something far larger. Was it a necessary act, a reckless gamble, or a provocation that could spiral out of control? Tell me in the comments, who crossed the line? And if you want to follow how a single incident can reshape an entire balance of power, subscribe. This may only be the beginning.